Now, the next set of studies I want to present have to do with the issue of racial profiling. The idea here is that when people think black, they think crime, and so the first study I just presented demonstrates this. But my colleagues and I wanted to argue that the association works in the opposite way as well. So when people think about crime, they think about black people, okay? Thinking about crime draws attention to black Americans. Under these conditions, black people are placed under surveillance. So I'm going to give you an example of this. This is another study my colleagues and I conducted with white male undergraduates. This time, half of the participants were subliminally primed with crime objects on the computer screen, and here it is in slow motion. Next, the participants were asked to complete a dot probe task, okay? And so for the dot probe task, they were shown on a computer screen a black face and a white face simultaneously. This time, they were shown the faces long enough to be detected. Those faces came on the screen and then they disappeared, and a dot appeared where one of the faces used to be, okay? And the participants' goal was to simply locate that dot on the computer screen as quickly as possible. Tell us whether that dot was to the left or the right of the computer screen, okay? And we hypothesized that when that dot was in the location of the black face, the participants who had been exposed to these crime objects beforehand would be faster at finding that dot than those who had not been exposed to those images. So the idea is that once we get people to think about crime, they'll begin to look at the black face. And we use the speed at which they could find this dot as a proxy for visual attention. The faster they are at finding that dot, the more likely it is that they're showing an attentional bias in that direction the whole time. Okay, so here are the results here for this study. We have along the vertical axis the mean reaction time to locate that dot on the computer screen. And the first thing we're going to do is to look at what happens when they're not primed with any crime images at all. And you can see here that they're faster to locate the dot when that dot is placed near the white face than when it's placed near the black face, okay? So they're faster to locate that dot because they're looking at the white face, okay? So when there's no manipulation at all, there's an in-group bias going on where white faces are attracting white study participants. Now, when the students are primed to think of crime, we get just the opposite effect, okay? They look at the black face. So as expected, exposing people to the crime-relevant objects placed the black male faces under surveillance. Now, we repeated this study with police officers. So the question here is, when police officers are on the lookout for criminal activity, when they're thinking about violent crime, will this lead them to focus on black faces? So this study is quite similar to the study I just showed you, but in this case, we primed half of the police officers with words associated with violent crime rather than images. So we exposed these officers to words like apprehend, arrest, capture, shoot. And you can see here that the pattern of results is identical to what we see with the students, okay? When the police officers are encouraged to think of arresting and shooting and capturing, they're drawn to the black face. Now, at the very end of the study, we took police officers through a surprise face identification task. We presented them with a black lineup and a white lineup, and we simply asked them to pick out the face that they were shown earlier in the study. Now, here's the black lineup. One of these faces we actually used in the real study with the officers, and it's also the face that I showed you in an earlier slide when I first introduced the study. How many people know which is the target face? How many people think it's 4? Okay. So the correct answer is number 4. So that's pretty good. Better than a lot of the police officers, actually. The police officers actually were able to do this task at above chance levels, so they could identify the target at above chance levels. But when they made a mistake on this task, the errors that they made were systematic. So what happened was, let me explain. We chose 2 of these faces to put in this lineup because they were rated by a separate group of study participants as more stereotypically black than the target. So those were faces 2 and 3. And then the other 2 faces were placed in the lineup because they were rated as less stereotypically black than the target. So those were faces 1 and 5. And what happened is when the officers made an error on this task and they were primed to think of crime, they thought they saw face number 3, or they thought they saw face number 2. Okay? So These results could have implications for eyewitness testimony. Black people who appear most stereotypically black may be the most vulnerable to false identifications in real lineups. Now, results like these could also have implications for sentencing decisions. In the next study I'm going to present, my colleagues and I were interested in how physical appearance could influence death sentencing decisions. Now, as John Darley reminds us, when people or jurors are deciding whether to punish someone with death or not, to some extent they're deciding what an adequate payment is to right the wrong that has been committed. Okay, so they're deciding on what type of payback would be just. And this just desserts perspective on punishment is well represented in the work of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he says here, punishment should be pronounced over all criminals proportionate to their internal wickedness. Okay? Proportionate to their internal wickedness. So in our research, we asked the question, could physical features that mark race be a proxy for internal wickedness? And if so, are black defendants who look more stereotypically black more likely to be perceived as wicked and punished accordingly? When we consider real defendants who've been convicted of first-degree murder, who should get life and who should get death? Perhaps an overlooked factor in understanding how the death penalty is decided upon has to do with this notion of internal wickedness. Perhaps still today, American citizens look upon a black face and use the blackness of his physical features as a proxy for internal wickedness, and perhaps they decide to punish accordingly. So we addressed this issue in this next study by using a large data set of death-eligible defendants that was put together by David Baldus and colleagues. We were able to locate the photographs of these defendants in this data set, and we gave these photographs to raters to have them judge the faces on stereotypicality, okay? And these participants had no idea what the study was about or how we got the faces or that the faces were actually the faces of convicted criminals. We just asked them to rate the faces on stereotypicality, and we were interested in whether those ratings could then predict whether the defendant got a life sentence or a death sentence. Now, the data I'm about to show you are for black defendants only, and you can see here that when black defendants who are convicted of killing black victims, you see that there's no stereotypicality effect. The death sentencing rate is exactly the same for those who are low and those who are high in stereotypicality. However, when you look at black defendants who are convicted of killing white victims, there's a huge stereotypicality effect, okay? So looking more black more than doubles your chances of receiving a death sentence. And this effect is significant even though we controlled for factors like aggravators and mitigators and the murder severity and the SES of the victim and the defendant and the attractiveness of the defendant. Black defendants are punished in proportion to the blackness of their physical features. So the next question is, why is this the case? Like, why does blackness matter only to the extent that the victims are white? And at first glance, these results seemed puzzling to us. But, you know, again, it resonates with decades of research demonstrating that convicted criminals are much more likely to be sentenced to death when their victims are white. So perhaps the internal wickedness of defendants matters most when the victims are most worthy of saving. So perhaps this result underscores how people value the lives of whites more than they value the lives of blacks. So in part 2 of my talk, I'm going to present studies designed to look at the most extreme form of black devaluation. And I'm going to argue that black people are not only viewed as criminal, but as somehow less human than whites. Now, of course, the dehumanization of black Americans has been a long-standing issue in this country. In 1934, W.E.B. Du Bois writes about this issue in the foreword to his classic book, Black Reconstruction. And he says here, it would be only fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person toward this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts I have set down. But this latter person I am not trying to convince. I am simply pointing out these 2 points of view, so obvious to Americans. And then without further ado, I am assuming the truth of the first. And fine, I'm going to tell this story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, realizing that this attitude will from the first seriously curtail my audience.